A woman may survive a broken promise, but not always the room that gathers to watch it break. Evelyn Hart heard those words once from her mother, years before Hartwell Manor lost its warmth, before the silver was sold, before every candle in the great hall was counted like a coin. On the evening of her engagement, those words returned to her as she stood beneath the amber glow of 3 crystal chandeliers, smiling as if her heart were not beating hard enough to shake the pearls at her throat. She was beautiful in a way that made people look twice, with bright hazel eyes, lively expressions she could never fully hide, and chestnut curls pinned with small white roses that trembled whenever she laughed. And Evelyn had laughed often that evening, not because she was careless, but because cheerfulness had always been her quiet rebellion against hardship. The guests admired her for it. The older ladies called her charming. The gentlemen called her radiant. The servants, watching from the edges of the paneled room, knew the truth more deeply. Miss Hart had spent the morning arranging flowers with her own hands, comforting a nervous kitchen maid, and slipping an extra $1 into the palm of the old footman whose boots had begun to split in the winter damp. Her gown was not new. The cream silk had belonged to her mother, altered carefully at the waist, its hem brushed clean, its sleeves softened with lace that caught the candlelight like frost. Yet she wore it as if it were royal satin, standing beside Charles Bennet while the entire county waited for him to place the engagement ring upon her finger. Charles looked handsome, polished, and faintly uncertain, his blonde hair smooth, his smile too practiced. Evelyn told herself not to notice the way his eyes kept drifting toward the doors. Beyond the tall windows, rain tapped lightly against the glass, and the November wind pressed cold fingers into the seams of the old house. The fire burned low in the marble hearth. The musicians near the west wall drew their bows across the strings, sending a delicate waltz into the air. Then the doors opened. Not loudly. Not with thunder. Only with the soft, deliberate sound of polished wood giving way. But every head turned. Grace Hart stood at the entrance in a gown of white silk so bright it seemed to challenge the candles themselves. Evelyn's younger sister had always known how to enter a room as if forgiveness were already owed to her. Her golden hair fell in perfect waves beneath a silver comb, and her smile carried the sweetness of poisoned honey. In one gloved hand, she held a folded letter sealed with dark wax. Evelyn felt the room shift before a single word was spoken. Charles went still beside her. The music faltered. Grace moved forward slowly, her pale skirts whispering over the floorboards, her eyes fixed not on her sister's face but on the ring waiting in Charles's hand. "Before he places that ring on her finger," Grace said, her voice soft enough to sound sorrowful and clear enough for every guest to hear, "Mr. Bennet deserves to know who Evelyn truly is." A murmur passed through the hall like wind through dead leaves. Evelyn's smile faded, but she did not lower her chin. She saw Mrs. Whitcomb press a hand to her chest. She saw Lord Avery lean closer to hear. She saw Charles's fingers tighten around the ring box. And from the shadowed gallery above the staircase, where the candlelight barely reached, another man watched in absolute silence. Alexander Whitmore, Duke of Ravensfield, had arrived late, dressed in black, his broad shoulders still carrying the cold of the rain outside. He had intended to remain unseen. He had intended to offer a brief courtesy to an old family's daughter and leave before supper. But now his gray eyes narrowed on the white-dressed girl with the letter, then shifted to Evelyn Hart, who stood alone in a room suddenly hungry for scandal. Grace broke the seal. Evelyn heard the faint tear of wax as sharply as if it had been made against her own skin. "I did not wish to do this," Grace whispered, though her eyes glittered. "But silence would make me guilty too." Charles turned toward Evelyn, and in that small movement, before any accusation had even been read, she understood the first wound of the evening. He was already doubting her. The room waited. The candles trembled. Evelyn folded her hands before her, lively no longer, but still lovely, still upright, still refusing to become the ruin they had gathered to see. The first sentence of Grace Hart's letter was gentle enough to sound like mercy, and that made it crueler. "My dear Charles," she read aloud, lowering her lashes as if the words wounded her to speak them, "I cannot accept your offer with an honest heart while another promise remains unpaid." A ripple of breath moved through the great hall. Evelyn felt it pass around her, over her, through her, like a draft finding every crack in an old house. Grace continued, each word chosen with the patience of a person placing stones upon a grave. The letter claimed that Evelyn had once accepted money from a former suitor in exchange for a private promise of marriage, then abandoned him when Charles Bennet's fortune became more useful. It spoke of debts, secret meetings, and a signature at the bottom that made Evelyn's stomach turn cold. Her own name. Written in her own hand, or near enough that even she, for one dreadful second, could not breathe. Charles stared at the page as if it had risen from the floor by itself. "Evelyn," he said quietly, but not with trust. Not even with confusion. With disappointment already prepared. That was the second wound. She turned to him, her hazel eyes bright beneath the candlelight, the natural warmth of her face held still by effort alone. "That letter is false," she said. Her voice did not break. It was not loud. It did not need to be. "I have never written such a promise. I have never taken money from any man for my hand." Grace pressed the paper to her heart. "I wish that were true." The words were soft, but her glance touched the guests one by one, gathering them into judgment. "I found it among Father's old accounts. I thought perhaps I misunderstood, until I saw the receipt folded with it." She lifted a second paper, smaller, creased, marked with ink. Mrs. Whitcomb gasped. Someone near the mantel whispered, "How dreadful." Another voice murmured, "Poor Mr. Bennet." Evelyn heard every syllable. She had spent years learning how to smile through lowered expectations, through unpaid bills, through the slow humiliation of a noble house becoming a subject of polite pity. But this was different. This was not pity. This was appetite. They wanted the letter to be true because scandal warmed a cold evening better than any fire. Charles stepped back half a foot. Only half a foot, yet it widened the space between them until it felt like a canyon. "Why would Grace invent such a thing?" he asked. Evelyn looked at him then, truly looked, and some small, hopeful part of her grew silent. "That is what I hoped you would ask me," she replied. Her lively spirit, the one that had filled Hartwell Manor with music even when money was gone, flickered behind her eyes but did not disappear. She turned toward the room, cheeks pale, chin lifted. "I will not defend myself against a lie by begging those who already wish to believe it." The sentence cut cleanly through the murmurs. Grace's smile tightened. From the shadowed gallery above, Alexander Whitmore watched Evelyn stand beneath 100 candle flames, abandoned by the man who was supposed to protect her name and surrounded by guests eager to see it ruined. He noticed what no one else did. Grace's gloved fingers trembled not with sorrow, but with excitement. Charles would not meet Evelyn's eyes. And the receipt Grace held bore a merchant's blue ribbon that had not been used in Hartwell Village for nearly 2 years. The Duke's expression did not change, but something in the air around him grew colder. Below, Grace lowered her voice to a trembling whisper. "Sister, please do not make this uglier than it must be. Admit the truth, and perhaps Mr. Bennet will show mercy." Evelyn almost laughed then, not from amusement, but from the bitter wonder of hearing mercy spoken by the hand that carried the knife of rumor. She looked at Grace, beautiful, shining, dressed in stolen innocence, and answered, "I have nothing to confess." Charles closed the ring box. The small snap echoed louder than the rain against the windows. In that sound, Evelyn felt the room decide her fate. Yet above them all, unseen by most and feared by those who knew his name, the Duke of Ravensfield turned from the gallery and began descending the stairs. Alexander Whitmore descended the staircase with the quiet certainty of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to command a room. The murmurs thinned before he reached the last step. Candlelight moved across the black wool of his evening coat, across the silver at his cuffs, across the hard, composed lines of a face society had learned to read carefully and fear when it could not. He did not look at Grace first. He looked at Evelyn. She stood near the center of the great hall with every eye upon her, her cream silk gown glowing softly against the dark panels, her chestnut curls still pinned with white roses that seemed too delicate for such a cruel room. Her face was pale, but not broken. Her hands were folded, but not helpless. Even now, with her engagement wounded in front of everyone who mattered to Hartwell County, there remained something bright in her, a spark of life that shame had not managed to extinguish. Alexander had seen many forms of courage. He had seen men boast loudly and fail quietly. He had seen noble ladies smile with daggers hidden behind their fans. But Evelyn Hart's courage was stranger and rarer. It wore lace. It held its chin high. It refused to ask an unworthy man for belief. "Your Grace," Charles Bennet said, startled into a bow that came half a second too late. "I was not aware you had taken interest in this private family matter." Alexander's grey eyes shifted to him. A private matter is not usually performed before 47 guests and a string quartet. A few faces lowered. The musicians, uncertain whether they had been accused of something, sat perfectly still with their bows suspended above the strings. Grace recovered first. She always did. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying with practiced grace, "I am sorry you have been made witness to such distress. I only wish to protect Mr. Bennet from deception." "How generous," Alexander replied. Nothing in his tone warmed the words. Grace's smile faltered, then returned more carefully. "I would have remained silent if honor had allowed it." Evelyn watched the Duke as if she could not decide whether his presence meant rescue or merely another witness to her humiliation. She had met him only twice before that evening. Once in the winter garden, where he had found her laughing with 2 children of the household staff while helping them rescue a kitten from beneath a bench. Once in the old library, where he had seen her bent over ledgers, her lively mouth set in determination as she moved figures from one column to another, trying to stretch poverty into dignity. He had not forgotten either moment. She had not tried to impress him. That alone had impressed him. "May I see the letter?" he asked. Grace held it a little closer. "It is delicate. So is a lady's reputation." The room went still again. Charles cleared his throat. "I believe, under the circumstances, it may be best to postpone the engagement until the matter is clarified." Evelyn turned toward him slowly. The ring box remained closed in his hand. He looked relieved by his own cowardice, as though calling retreat prudence made it less shameful. "Postpone," Evelyn repeated. One word. Soft as falling ash. Charles avoided her eyes. "Only until there is no doubt." "There was no doubt until my sister entered the room," Evelyn said. A murmur moved again, but weaker now, uncertain. Alexander saw Grace's gaze flicker toward Charles, quick and intimate, the kind of glance that should not pass between a woman and her sister's intended. Charles answered it with the smallest tightening of his mouth. There it was. Not proof. Not yet. But a thread. Alexander had spent years following threads through darker rooms than this. The past rose in him like cold water, a sealed accusation, a forged account, a friend who had smiled while placing ruin at his door. He had learned then that lies loved an audience, and truth often arrived late because it traveled alone. He stepped closer to Evelyn, not enough to claim her, only enough that the room could no longer pretend she stood without any ally. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice lower now, "did you write that letter?" Her eyes met his. They were bright with anger, hurt, and something almost like disbelief that he had asked her directly rather than spoken around her. "No, Your Grace." "Did you take payment for a promise of marriage?" "No, did you deceive Mr. Bennet?" Her mouth trembled once, not with weakness, but with the force of all she refused to say. "No." Alexander held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to the room. "Then I suggest no one condemn her before the ink has been examined, the receipt has been verified, and the person most eager to display both has explained how she came to possess them." Grace's face lost a shade of color. Outside, rain whispered harder against the glass. Evelyn drew one quiet breath, and for the first time that evening, the room seemed less hungry for her ruin than afraid of what the Duke might uncover. Charles Bennet looked down at the closed ring box in his hand as though it had become a burden too heavy for one gentleman to carry. The little velvet case, so harmless an hour before, now seemed to contain the measure of his character. Evelyn saw his thumb move over the lid, restless, uncertain, unwilling to open and unwilling to put it away. Around them, the guests stood beneath the golden chandeliers with their mouths quiet and their eyes wide, each person pretending not to stare while staring all the same. Grace still held the letter, but the triumph had thinned from her face since the Duke began asking questions. She had expected outrage. She had expected tears. She had expected Evelyn to tremble and Charles to step cleanly away from scandal. She had not expected Alexander Whitmore to stand beside her sister like a dark wall between a candle and the wind. "Your Grace," Charles said at last, smoothing his voice into something careful, "surely you understand my position. A man cannot proceed with an engagement while such serious doubts remain." Alexander did not answer immediately. He looked at Charles with such stillness that the younger man shifted his weight. "A man may do many things, Mr. Bennet," he said. "The question is whether he will do them honorably." A flush crept up Charles's neck. "I will not be lectured in my own engagement hall." "This is not your hall," Evelyn said softly. Charles turned, startled, as if he had forgotten the house had belonged to her family long before his fortune entered the conversation. The words had left her quietly, but they carried. Hartwell Manor seemed to hear them too. The dark oak walls, the old portraits, the tired marble fireplace, the silver candlesticks polished until their age almost disappeared. All of it was hers in memory, if no longer in money. Charles's jaw tightened. "I did not mean it that way." "No," Evelyn replied, her bright eyes dimmed but steady. "You rarely do." Grace stepped between them with the graceful sorrow of an actress who knew the audience still watched. "Please, Evelyn, do not turn this into cruelty. Mr. Bennet has been placed in an impossible situation." "By whom?" Alexander asked. Grace blinked. "By the truth. The truth does not usually arrive wearing a white gown to another woman's engagement." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut the music from memory. Several guests glanced at Grace's dress for the first time with new understanding. Grace's fingers tightened on the letter. "I wore white because I came in innocence." "Innocence rarely announces itself," the Duke said. Evelyn almost turned to look at him, but she kept her gaze forward. Something inside her wanted to lean toward that voice, not because it was warm, but because it was firm. She had spent so long being cheerful for everyone else that firmness felt almost like shelter. Charles took one step away from her. It was a small movement, smaller than a yard, yet every person in the room understood it. He was choosing distance. He was choosing safety. He was choosing himself. "Until this matter is settled," he said, opening his palm to reveal the ring box, "I believe the engagement must be suspended." The words landed with the dullness of a door closing at the end of a long corridor. Evelyn did not move. She had imagined this night differently, not romantically perhaps, but with hope. Hope that duty might become companionship. Hope that a practical marriage might still contain respect. Hope that Charles, if not brave, was at least decent. That hope folded inside her without sound. Grace lowered her eyes, but Evelyn saw the tiny curve at the edge of her mouth. Alexander saw it too. More importantly, he saw Charles look at Grace the moment after, not with outrage, not with confusion, but with apology. The thread became a cord. The cord became a noose of their own making. "Very well," Alexander said. Charles exhaled, relieved too soon. "Then you agree this should be handled privately?" "No," the Duke turned toward the butler waiting near the side doors. "Mr. Halloway, please close the main doors. No guest need leave before Miss Hart receives the same public consideration as the accusation made against her." A startled stir moved through the hall. Mr. Halloway hesitated only long enough to bow, then obeyed. The heavy doors shut with a deep wooden sound that seemed to seal the evening inside its own judgment. Grace's face paled. Charles's relief vanished. Evelyn finally looked at Alexander. He did not smile. He did not offer comfort wrapped in softness. He simply stood there, unshaken, as if the storm had entered the room and chosen her side. "Now," the Duke said, extending one gloved hand toward the letter, "let us begin with the ink." Grace did not surrender the letter at once. Her gloved hand remained curled around the folded page, the dark wax broken against her palm, while every candle in Hartwell Manor seemed to lean closer. Alexander waited without impatience. That was the frightening thing about him. He did not press. He did not plead. He simply extended his hand and allowed the silence to become heavier than refusal. At last, with a smile that had lost its sweetness, Grace placed the paper in his palm. "You will find nothing improper, Your Grace," she said. "I only regret that my sister forced us to examine such shame in company." Evelyn's eyes moved to her then, not wounded now, but clear. "You brought the shame into this room, Grace." A faint color touched Grace's cheeks. Before she could answer, Alexander carried the letter to the nearest candelabrum, holding it beneath the amber light. The guests watched the angle of his wrist, the lowered line of his brow, the calm severity with which he studied the ink. Charles stood beside the cold fireplace, one hand still around the ring box, looking less like an injured bridegroom than a man awaiting permission to escape. Evelyn saw him, and with that sight came not fresh pain, but memory. 3 months earlier, Hartwell Manor had been colder than it was tonight. Not because winter had fully come, but because coal cost money, and money had become something Evelyn measured in spoonfuls, candles, hems repaired instead of replaced, and meals stretched thin enough that the servants did not notice. She had sat in the small morning room with account books spread before her, the lively sparkle in her face dimmed only by arithmetic. Her father's final illness had left debts like shadows in every corridor. Creditors wrote in polite language, but their meaning was never polite. Pay, or lose the land. Pay, or dismiss the staff. Pay, or watch Hartwell become another house spoken of in past tense. Evelyn had sold her mother's pearl earrings first. Then the little sapphire brooch. Then 2 horses, though she had cried privately afterward because old Thomas, the groom, had raised them from foals. She had done it all with a smile in public, with bright words at breakfast, with music in the afternoons for the younger maids who were frightened by whispers of dismissal. Grace had watched from silk cushions and complained that the ribbons from Philadelphia were late. "You make poverty look almost noble," Grace had said once, her voice light. "It is not poverty I am trying to make noble," Evelyn answered. "It is us." That had been the beginning of Grace's hatred, or perhaps only the moment Evelyn finally recognized it. Then came Charles Bennet with his careful manners, his comfortable fortune, and his promise that marriage would settle the largest debts within 30 days. Evelyn had not loved him, but she had believed him decent. She had believed decency could be enough when affection was not offered. She had accepted his proposal beneath the bare branches of the east garden, while Grace watched from an upstairs window, her face pale behind the glass. The memory faded as Alexander turned the letter slightly toward the flame. "Curious," he said. One word, and the room tightened. Grace lifted her chin. "What is curious?" "This ink has not browned at the edges." He glanced at Charles. A letter supposedly written more than a year ago should not look as if it dried this week. Charles swallowed. Grace gave a small laugh. "I am sure ink ages differently depending on storage." "Sometimes," Alexander said. "Lies do as well. They either decay, or they reveal who preserved them." Evelyn felt the room shift again, but this time not against her. The Duke unfolded the smaller receipt and studied the blue ribbon stitched to its corner. For the first time that evening, his expression changed. Not much. Only a slight narrowing of the eyes. But Grace saw it, and fear crossed her face like a cloud over snow. Alexander lowered the receipt and looked toward the butler. "Mr. Halloway, send for the village stationer if he is still among the guests." The old butler bowed. "He is, Your Grace." Mr. Alden came with his wife. Grace took one small step backward. Evelyn noticed. So did Alexander. Charles looked at Grace before he could stop himself. In that single glance, all his caution betrayed him more clearly than any confession. Evelyn stood very still, her cream gown brushing the polished floor, her beauty no longer bright with easy laughter but sharpened by dignity. She had given everything to keep Hartwell standing, and now the truth, slow and cold as dawn, had begun to rise in the room where her ruin was meant to be celebrated. Mr. Alden was brought forward from the back of the hall with his wife's anxious hand still resting on his sleeve. He was a narrow, elderly man with silver spectacles, ink-stained fingers, and the careful expression of someone who understood that paper could ruin lives as easily as fire. The guests parted for him in uneasy silence. Only the rain continued its soft tapping against the tall windows, steady and patient, as if the night itself had chosen to listen. Alexander placed the receipt upon a small mahogany table beside the candelabrum. "Mr. Alden," he said, "you own the stationer's shop on Willow Street." "For 32 years, Your Grace." "And this ribbon?" The old man leaned close, adjusting his spectacles. The blue strip stitched at the corner looked harmless enough, no wider than a lady's finger, but the moment he saw it, his brows rose. "That is from my shop, certainly." Grace released the smallest breath, almost a laugh of relief. "Then there is nothing more to discuss." "Not quite, Miss Hart," Mr. Alden said, still peering down. "I only began using blue ribbon on private receipts this past spring. Before that, it was green." The room altered at once. No one moved, and yet everything shifted. Charles's face emptied of color. Grace's hand tightened around the side of her gown until the white silk wrinkled beneath her fingers. Evelyn felt the words enter her slowly, not as triumph, not yet, but as air after being held too long underwater. The receipt could not be old. The accusation could not be what Grace claimed. Alexander's voice remained calm. This letter was said to be more than a year old. Mr. Alden nodded. "Then the receipt was not attached to it at the time. That ribbon did not exist in my ledgers until 6 months ago." A whisper rose, then scattered. Mrs. Whitcomb covered her mouth. Lord Avery muttered something under his breath. Near the fireplace, Charles looked at Grace, and this time his glance carried accusation instead of secret apology. Grace saw it and turned wounded eyes upon him. "Charles, surely you do not believe I would invent such a thing." It was the first time she had spoken his name too familiarly in public. Evelyn heard it. So did the room. Alexander let the mistake hang untouched for 3 heartbeats. Then he said, "Mr. Bennet, did Miss Grace Hart consult you before tonight?" Charles straightened too quickly. "No," before answering again, "consider the advantage of truth over convenience." Charles's mouth opened, then closed. He was not a wicked man in the grand, dramatic sense. He was worse in a quieter way. He was weak when courage was expensive. He wanted comfort, admiration, and a wife who would never require him to be honorable at a cost. Grace had offered him all 3. Evelyn saw the answer before he gave it. She mentioned concerns, Charles said. "Only concerns." Grace turned sharply toward him. "I came to you because I feared for your future." "And did you ask him to suspend the engagement?" Alexander asked. Grace's eyes flashed. "I asked him not to bind himself blindly." "How thoughtful," the Duke said. "And did you also ask him, once your sister was set aside, whether he might consider binding himself elsewhere?" A sound passed through the guests, soft and shocked. Charles looked at the floor. Grace's cheeks flushed, no longer with sorrow but with anger she could barely dress as innocence. "This is insulting." So was the letter. Alexander turned to Mr. Halloway, who waited near the closed doors. "Bring in the small wooden box delivered to my carriage this evening." Evelyn looked at him then. "Your carriage?" He did not answer her directly, but his eyes softened by a fraction. "Your father wrote to me before he died, Miss Hart. He feared someone near you would one day use his debts against you. I came tonight because I owed him a debt of my own." The words moved through Evelyn with a force she could not show. Her father, who had hidden his worry behind tired smiles. Her father, who had called her his brave little lantern because she kept laughing even when the house grew dark. The butler returned carrying a polished wooden box no larger than a Bible. Alexander opened it with a brass key from his waistcoat. Inside lay folded letters, a ledger page, and a sealed note bearing her father's hand. Grace stared at the box as if it had spoken her name. "This is absurd," she whispered. Alexander lifted the ledger page. "Not absurd. Documented." He looked across the hall, and for the first time his voice carried the full weight of his title. The late Mr. Hart did not leave his eldest daughter a fortune. He left her something far rarer in rooms such as this. The truth. Evelyn stood beneath the chandeliers, still pale, still beautiful, but no longer alone. And Grace, who had come dressed like innocence, began to understand that the Duke had not merely interrupted her plan. He had arrived with the one thing lies feared most. Alexander did not open the sealed note first. He left it resting inside the wooden box, untouched beneath the trembling candlelight, as if even paper deserved dignity when it carried a dead man's trust. Instead, he unfolded the ledger page and placed it beside the forged receipt. The two documents lay on the mahogany table like witnesses called from different worlds, one stained by years of honest worry, the other too fresh, too clean, too eager to accuse. "Mr. Alden," Alexander said, "will you examine the handwriting on the receipt?" The old stationer leaned over it again, his spectacles catching small sparks of gold from the candelabrum. "The signature resembles Miss Evelyn Hart's hand," he said carefully, "but resemblance is not identity." Grace found her voice. "Anyone can say that when pressured by a duke." Mr. Alden's face stiffened. "I have served this county since before you were born, Miss Hart. I know the hands of half its families because I have sold them paper, ink, mourning cards, wedding invitations, and apology notes they should have sent sooner." A nervous laugh almost rose in the room, but fear swallowed it. Alexander placed the ledger page closer. "Compare it to this." Mr. Alden studied both. Evelyn remained still, though every nerve in her seemed drawn tight as violin strings. She had written those ledger entries by lamplight night after night, adding columns with cold fingers, turning expenses into sacrifices and sacrifices into another week of survival. Her handwriting was familiar to her as her own breath, firm when she was determined, slanted when she was tired, more open when she wrote after one of her rare laughing moments. The receipt had copied the shape, but not the soul. "This is not the same hand," Mr. Alden said at last. "The capital E is forced. Miss Hart forms hers naturally, with a slight upward tail." Whoever wrote the receipt watched her letters but did not understand her habit. Evelyn closed her eyes for 1 second. Only one. When she opened them, Grace was staring at Charles as if willing him to rescue her from the very trap she had built. Charles did nothing. Alexander took from the box a second folded paper. "There is more." Grace lifted her chin, but the movement was brittle now. "Of course there is. A duke always has more when he decides a woman is guilty." "I have not decided you are guilty," Alexander said. "You are doing that quite effectively without my assistance." The line struck the room with quiet force. He unfolded the paper. "This is a note sent to my steward 2 weeks ago by a maid formerly employed at Hartwell Manor. Her name is Clara May." Evelyn looked up sharply. Clara had vanished after helping prepare the guest rooms, leaving only a brief message about a sick aunt in Baltimore. Evelyn had worried for her, had even set aside $2 from the household tin in case Clara returned hungry. She wrote that she was paid to take 3 sheets of stationery from your writing desk, Miss Hart, Alexander continued. She did not know why at first. When she learned, she became frightened and sought protection. Grace's lips parted. "A servant's word?" "A servant's conscience," Alexander corrected. "There is often more honor there than at polished tables." Near the side doors, Mr. Holloway bowed his head slightly, and several servants standing in the shadows did the same. Evelyn felt tears threaten then, not from humiliation, but from the painful tenderness of being defended in all the places where no one had thought defense mattered. "Who paid Clara?" Charles asked, too late to sound innocent. Alexander did not look away from Grace. "She was paid through a silver locket, later sold to Mr. Alden's nephew at the pawn counter on Market Street." Mr. Alden nodded grimly. "I remember it. White enamel, small crack near the clasp." A whisper left Mrs. Whitcomb. Miss Grace wore such a locket last Easter. Grace's composure cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the small collapse of her perfect mouth. Many women own lockets. Evelyn spoke then, her voice soft but bright with all the life they had tried to dim. Not that one. Mother gave it to you when you turned 16. You said it was too plain. Grace turned on her, eyes shining. You always had to be beloved for needing less. The room froze. There it was, the true letter beneath the false one. Not ink. Not debt. Envy. Alexander let the confession breathe. Then he lifted the sealed note from the box and held it toward Evelyn. Your father asked that this be given to you if anyone ever tried to make your goodness look like shame. Evelyn took the note with trembling fingers. The wax bore her father's old crest, worn at the edges, familiar as childhood. For the first time that evening, her courage almost failed her, because love, when returned from the grave, can wound more deeply than cruelty. Evelyn held her father's note as if it were made not of paper, but of breath. The wax seal gave way beneath her thumb with a fragile crack, and for one suspended moment, the entire hall seemed to withdraw from her. The guests, the candles, Grace's white gown, Charles's pale face, even the rain against the windows blurred into distance. Only the handwriting remained. Her father's hand, slanted and familiar, shaped by years of ledgers, letters, and bedtime stories written in the margins of newspapers when she was little. My dearest Evelyn, the note began, if these words have reached you, then someone has mistaken your kindness for weakness and your silence for guilt. Forgive an old father for knowing too late how much you carried for this house. Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came. She saw him again as he had been in his final weeks, seated near the east window with a blanket over his knees, pretending the sunlight warmed him more than it did. He had smiled whenever she entered the room too brightly, as if he knew her laughter was a lamp she lit for others while standing in the dark herself. She continued reading, her voice steady enough for the room to hear. I leave no fortune worthy of you. I leave only testimony. My eldest daughter sold what she loved to protect those who depended on us. She kept servants paid when her own dresses were mended in secret. She spoke cheerfully so fear would not master this house. If any person claims she traded her honor for money, let that person stand before God, society, and their own conscience, for they have lied against the best soul I have ever known. The final words trembled in the air long after she stopped speaking. No one whispered now. Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes were wet. Mr. Halloway stood rigid near the doors, his old face turned away for dignity's sake. Grace looked as though the note had struck some hidden chamber inside her where envy had lived undisturbed for years. Charles stared at Evelyn as if seeing her only after losing the right to look. Evelyn, he said, stepping forward, I did not understand. She lowered the letter slowly. The lively light in her eyes returned, not playful now, but clear and unafraid. No, Mr. Bennet. You did not try. The formality of his name wounded him more than anger would have. He glanced toward the guests, then toward Alexander, searching for some path back to respectability. I was misled. You were willing, Alexander said. Charles stiffened. Your Grace, I have admitted my error. An error is misplacing a glove. You abandoned a woman's honor at the first convenient shadow. Grace made a small, desperate sound. This has gone far enough. She moved toward Evelyn, her beauty sharpened by panic, her white skirt sweeping against the polished floor. You think this makes you noble? Standing there with father's blessing, letting everyone pity you again? Evelyn did not step back. I do not want pity, Grace. You always wanted worship. No, Evelyn said softly. I wanted a sister. The words landed more gently than accusation and therefore more painfully. Grace's face twisted with humiliation, and for one reckless second she lifted her hand, not with force enough to harm, but with the childish fury of someone denied the ending she had imagined. Alexander moved before the room could gasp. He did not seize her harshly. He simply caught her wrist in the air with controlled stillness, stopping the gesture before it became another stain upon the evening. His voice was low, colder than the rain. You will not touch her. Grace froze. Every guest saw it. Every servant saw it. Charles saw it and did nothing, which became its own confession. Alexander released Grace's wrist at once, stepping back with the restraint of a gentleman who understood that power required discipline. You came here to ruin her, he said, each word clear beneath the chandeliers. You have only revealed yourself. Grace's eyes filled, but the tears served her poorly now. The room had already learned the difference between sorrow and performance. Mr. Halloway opened the doors at Alexander's nod, and the sound of rain grew louder, fresh and cold from the night beyond. Miss Grace Hart, the Duke continued, you will retire from this hall. Mr. Bennet, you will remain only long enough to return what was never yours to hold. Charles looked down at the ring box. His fingers trembled as he placed it on the table beside the false letter, the false receipt, and the true note. Evelyn watched him do it, and felt not defeat, but release. Her engagement had ended, yes. But the thing Grace had come to destroy had not been love. It had been a bargain dressed in flowers. And now, with the candles burning high and the whole room bearing witness, Evelyn Hart stood unpromised, unbroken, and more herself than she had been when the evening began. For a long moment after Charles set down the ring box, no one moved. It sat upon the mahogany table beneath the chandeliers, small, dark, and strangely powerless beside the false letter, the false receipt, and the true words of Evelyn's father. The musicians had lowered their instruments. The servants remained by the walls. The guests who had arrived hungry for celebration and then hungrier for scandal now stood with the chastened stillness of people who had mistaken cruelty for entertainment. Grace was escorted from the hall by Mrs. Whitcomb and one of the older maids, not dragged, not shamed with spectacle, but removed with the quiet firmness reserved for a guest who had forgotten every rule of decency. At the threshold, she looked back once. Evelyn met her eyes. There was no triumph in Evelyn's face, only a grief too tired to perform itself. That wounded Grace more deeply than anger would have, and she disappeared into the corridor with her white skirts whispering like snow over stone. Charles remained near the fireplace, his handsome face stripped of its easy confidence. Miss Hart, he said, I know I have no right to ask forgiveness tonight, but I hope someday you will understand that I was afraid. Evelyn looked at him, and the lively girl who had once tried to make every room brighter seemed to stand beside the woman who had survived this one. I do understand, she said. That is why I cannot marry you. He bowed his head. It was not enough, but it was something. Mr. Halloway opened the doors fully then, and the guests began to leave in murmuring clusters, their silk gowns and black coats passing into the rain-washed night with less pride than they had carried in. Some paused before Evelyn. Mrs. Whitcomb kissed her cheek. Mr. Alden bowed with ink-stained fingers pressed to his heart. One elderly tenant's wife, who had somehow been invited out of gratitude for years of service, whispered, Your father would be proud, Miss Evelyn. That nearly broke her. Not the scandal. Not Charles. Not Grace. Kindness. Kindness was always the blade she could not defend against. When the hall had emptied, the candles seemed softer. Hartwell Manor no longer felt like a theater of judgment, but an old house that had survived another storm. Evelyn stood beside the table, her father's note folded carefully in both hands. Alexander Whitmore remained a few paces away, giving her space as naturally as others had taken it from her. Your Grace, she said at last, her voice quiet, you saved my name tonight. No, he replied. I prevented others from stealing it. There is a difference. She looked up at him then. Rain silvered the windows behind his dark figure. His gray eyes, so severe before the crowd, held something gentler now, something worn and honest. Why did you truly come? She asked. Alexander glanced toward the wooden box. Your father saved my life once, years ago, when reputation mattered less than breath. I owed him more than a courtesy call. And now the debt is paid. He studied her face, the bright hazel eyes still rimmed with unshed tears, the chestnut curls loosening from their pins, the beauty of her made stronger by everything that had failed to destroy it. No, he said. Now I know why he trusted me with it. Evelyn lowered her gaze, not from shyness, but because the words had reached a place untouched by applause or apology. I have no engagement now, she said softly. No fortune worth naming. A house full of debts. A sister who hates me. And a reputation repaired only because you were generous enough to stand in the way. Alexander stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance. You have a house that still stands because you held it together. Servants who would defend you with tears in their eyes. A father's blessing. A name that survived public accusation. And a heart that did not become cruel when cruelty would have been easier. The last candle near the staircase flickered. Evelyn's breath caught, but she managed a faint, almost familiar spark of a smile. You speak as though those things are a dowry. They are rarer. He reached for the signet ring on his right hand, a heavy silver band marked with the crest of Ravensfield. Slowly, with no theatrical flourish, he removed it. Then Alexander Whitmore, the feared duke whom society called cold, lowered himself to one knee on the polished floor of Hartwell Manor. Evelyn stared at him, stunned beyond speech. Miss Hart, he said, his voice steady, I will not ask for an answer born from shock, gratitude, or the ruins of another man's promise. I ask only for the right to court you openly, honorably, and before every person who thought tonight would end with your disgrace. I cannot promise a life without storms. But I can promise that no storm will find you standing alone again. Evelyn looked at the ring in his palm, then at the table where Charles's small velvet box remained closed forever. One ring had been offered as a bargain. The other was offered as shelter. She placed her hand lightly over Alexander's, not accepting everything, not yet, but accepting the beginning. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, the old house held its breath as Evelyn Hart, still beautiful, still bright, still unbroken, smiled through the last of her tears. Some hearts are not rescued from ruin by love. Some are simply seen at last, and in being seen, remember they were never ruined at all.